Hello, everybody. I want to welcome everyone. My name is Rachel. I'm the Executive Director of Storyline. Storyline builds power with story and strategy. I want to welcome everyone on behalf of Storyline and my wonderful co-hosts, Arts and Democracy, U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, Naturally Occurring Cultural Districts, New York, and the Laundromat Project. We're going to be adding some descriptions that explain a little bit more about our organization, so you can check that out in the chat. Just a couple housekeeping notes. We're recording this event so we can share it with all the people that can't be with us tonight. And so if you prefer not to be seen, we invite you to turn off your video. Closed captioning is available. To activate this option, click on the CC button, which is in a Zoom toolbar at the bottom of the window, and then click on live transcription. Again, the CC button in the Zoom toolbar, and then click on live transcription. Now we have some incredible people that will be speaking today as part of the conversation in the first half of the event, and a wealth of knowledge from all of you that I'm excited to have you share in the breakout discussions. We wanted to have this conversation today to create a space for folks to talk about their process with storytelling. We don't necessarily always often take the time to really talk about what it's like, the challenges and the successes, and to really think about the lessons that we can share in particularly this challenging moment. There's a lot that has been learned in past storytelling work, and so I'm so excited for you to hear from the people we have talking today. So yeah, storytelling in the midst of crisis, whether or not it's an urgent moment, single moment, or storytelling crisis that lasts decades, it can be isolating. And so we're just excited to have people join us today to share with each other.
Credentials for his
we'd like to invite.
Sorry, Rachel, you've been muted. Can you unmute yourself?
Don't hear you.
Don't
Rachel,
hear you.
you've been muted. Can you unmute yourself, please?
Totally. So we just want to invite you to introduce yourselves in the chat by entering your name, pronoun, affiliation, and location. You can feel free to use native-land.ca if you'd like. So we'd love to hear just where you're coming from today. And I'll pass it off to Jordan from USDAC.
Welcome, everybody. I'm so happy to see you all tonight and be a part of tonight's conversation. My name's Jordan Seabury. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm lucky to serve as co-director of the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture. We're really excited to welcome you all here today. We'll be getting into the conversation soon, but first, I just wanted to take a quick moment and continue a practice that we try to embody here at the USDAC to honor Native sovereignty in all of the work that we do. Every community that we are a part of, our team at the USDAC, and everyone who's joining us today, every community owes its existence, its vitality to ancestors who built their hopes, their dreams, and their energy toward making the history that we live in today. So we try to honor that truth with what we think of as really just a first step toward action, a very simple statement, and I'll ask you to do the same. I am sitting right now on the ancestral lands of the Narragansett and the Wampanoag people, what is for now called Providence, Rhode Island. I want to pay respect to their elders past and present, and I'm asking you to take a moment to consider those same legacies of displacement, of migration, violence, and settlement that bring us all here today to the place that we each individually call home. So I hope you'll take a moment using the chat box function to type in the name of the ancestral stewards of your home. And if you don't know, that's fine. Say exactly that. I encourage you to say that. I will drop, in a moment, I'll drop a link to a native land map, and I encourage you to take a look at who the ancestral stewards are for the land that you do call home. More importantly than that, we're asking you to commit to opening your next meeting, whether that's in person, over Zoom, with a similar land acknowledgement, whether it's at a school, at a house of worship, at an office, at a nonprofit. We want to start normalizing that practice, and we want to spread it in all of our circles and all of the work that we do. I'll drop a link to the USDAC guide on native land acknowledgement in the chat as well, and I encourage you to take a look. Let us know what you think, especially if you're new to land acknowledgements and want to figure out how to incorporate them into your life. Again, it's one very simple first step, but we hope it's a first step that puts folks toward right relationship and ready to step into action. So with that, I am very happy to pass the virtual microphone to our friend Michael with Storyline Media, who's going to lead us into the next part of our conversation tonight.
Thank you, Jordan. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you all today. My name is Michael Primo. I'm an artist and a journalist. I work with Storyline. Together, Rachel and I have been creating work in a bunch of different mediums over the last 15 years that have addressed or have worked in response to a variety of different sort of acute or systemic crises. And, you know, I want to give a particular shout out to Rachel. During the pandemic, we were flooded with lots of people sort of, you know, asking us, oh man, you know, this is like the crisis of all crises in this moment, but it's laying bare all these other things that, you know, we see in my community on a day-to-day basis. How do we tell stories? What do we do? And so in response, Rachel had the idea that it would be great to try to learn from each other. And so we're very blessed and privileged to be part of a community of storytellers, among whom are our esteemed co-hosts this evening, to come together to hopefully will be the first of hopefully many conversations we can have with this existing and new community around this sort of idea of storytelling in crisis. I don't think there's, I think it's important to acknowledge that there's nothing new about the impulse that all of us are experiencing when we think about like responding to the events and the situation in our lives by saying, man, how do we tell this story? I mean, in some ways, the first poet was probably responding to the crisis of a broken heart, or some epic war over land and resources in ancient times, right? And I think that's a situation that has persisted. After having done this work for 15 or 20 years, I do think that we have some profound opportunities, and I'm really excited about this particular moment that we are in. I think there's a growing understanding from not just the people who do this work, but culturally, socially, who are really understand how acute crises can reveal the wreckage of chronic social conditions. And I think that's what motivates many of my colleagues who I'm blessed with the opportunity to share in conversation with right now. And reading through the survey responses that each and every one of you replied to, it seems like that's sort of a common thread in the work that you do. In the sort of honor this sort of participatory nature of the work that we do, we're really grateful for all the survey responses that everyone sent. After this event, Tom and NOCD are going to be sending a list of some of the projects that people shared. If you haven't already shared resources, Tom has just dropped, I think, a link in the chat so that you can continue to share projects, or if more projects have come to mind, please add them. We want this to be a resource so that coming out of this session, there can be lots and lots of inspiring projects that folks can look at and see. And so in that vein as well, we're really grateful for each and every one of you who took the time to fill out this survey and offer questions that you would like to see addressed. Marshall on our team and other members of the co-hosting team have diligently gone through that questions and sort of organized them into groupings, and that informs sort of the process of inquiry that we'll engage in with these amazing folks who I hope you'll be able to learn from. Just so we can get a sense of who's in the room. If this was in person, we might have a quick opportunity for go-arounds or some kind of breakout groups, but it's Zoom, it's virtual, which is a blessing in disguise in some ways, because we have RSVPs from Egypt and Venezuela, as well as North America, which is really exciting. I think there was someone from Ecuador as well. And sorry if I'm not mentioning all your countries. I got lost in the sheer amount of places represented in those surveys, which is really exciting. And I think a really profound opportunity that this sort of virtual environment allows us to really have this dialogue across cultures and across continents. So folks know who's in the room. We had about 700 plus RSVPs, and among those people who RSVP'd, most of you sort of shared kind of how you identify professionally in the work that you do. And while many of you, like myself, are sort of multi-hyphenated hustlers, I just want to kind of list sort of the definitions that emerged among you all, so you have a sense of kind of who's in the room and how folks are approaching this work. The biggest category of sort of self-identification was education. The second largest sort of grouping of self-identification in terms of how you identify and you're approaching this work is community or cultural organizing and activism. The next category was writing. A lot of writers. I see you writers. We need more writers. As then the next from there is performance, theater and dance, film, archiving, audio documentary, and then we have a small grouping of folks from philanthropy, public health, relief, recovery, and mutual aid. So, it's a very broad swath of people that are approaching this work from a variety of different angles. And so we welcome you into the space. If you're just arriving and are arriving now after our introductions by Rachel and Jordan, please keep up adding your name, any land acknowledgement or shout outs to regional affiliations or work that you're doing in those chats. I'm really blessed with this opportunity to engage in conversation with three people who I can, proudly say that I'm a card-carrying, T-shirt wearing fan club member of each of these individuals. So I'm excited to, engage in a little bit of conversation and learn from what they've learned, because their work each inspires me in a different sort of way. So we'll get right into it. Thank you for joining me. I think we have, let's see here, where's my list of our participants? We have Regina Campbell, who is a educator and the project manager of the Rikers Public Memory Project. Dr. Steven Thrasher is joining us as well. He's a journalist and professor at Northeastern University and the author of the forthcoming book, The Viral Underclass. And not last, but certainly not least, we have Nick Sly, who is a New Orleans-born performer, producer, and cultural organizer. Thank you for joining me, folks. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Michael. Pleasure to be here.
Given the sort of makeup of the audience and the sort of large amount of people coming to this work as cultural organizers, I wonder if we can begin with you, Regina. I've really admire the work that you're doing at the Rikers Public Media Memory Project. It's quite extraordinary. And it also speaks to, I think, what a lot of people, at least who are sort of gathered here today, are asking is how they can engage in a project that's sort of motivated by a core sort of political choice or advocacy goal, or are campaigners around some particular issue and are saying, okay, look, storytelling is something that we all recognize is important. It's a hot topic right now, which is really, really fortunate for the work that we do. How do we approach that work? So I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about the three groups that sort of came together to form Rikers Public Memory Project and how you conceived of what your focus would be with the work.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you for having me here this evening. And that's just such a powerful question and kind of integral into what we're doing at the Rikers Public Memory Project. The three organizations that you asked about were Freedom Agenda, which is a member-led organization that is made up of directly impacted people and communities. And there are boots on the ground activists that are working to close Rikers Island. And that's really how the Rikers Public Memory Project came about, was, we have this initiative, this project to campaign to close Rikers Island, but what happens after it's closed, right? How do we ensure that as Rikers is closed, that the memory of Rikers is told by the people that were most directly impacted? And how do we make sure we hold the city accountable for the harms that were done at Rikers Island? So three organizations, Freedom Agenda, Create Forward, and Humanities Action Lab, decided to come together to form this partnership under the umbrella of the Rikers Public Memory Project. And everything that we are doing centers around closing Rikers Island jails and reinvesting in directly impacted communities. And what does that look like, right? And what was really important is that it's not the organizations that it's deciding what that looks like, it's the community. It's the people that are directly impacted by Rikers Island. So from every stage of the process of even deciding what was going to be the makeup of the Rikers Public Memory Project, how were we going to collect the stories, how are we going to activate the stories, who we think the important audience is for these stories, has all been directly guided by people that were directly impacted and who are currently being directly impacted. Because we know, as we're watching the news, we're hearing stories about Rikers Island on a daily basis. This year has been horrendous at Rikers Island. We thought that things were bad with the pandemic, and we've seen the atrocities continually playing out. So while it's a Rikers Public Memory Project, we're really documenting what's happening in the moment, right? So everything that we do within the Rikers Public Memory Project directly impacts the individual organizations that are have formed together.
That's great. Can you talk to us a little bit about what forms those stories take? Right now, I feel like many people are very overwhelmed by the sort of how many options there are between video, a theater, a song. Like talk to us about why you chose the medium that you chose.
So we chose oral histories because after a year long of fact finding and searching and speaking to members in the community to find out, what this project should look like, two things were really important: education and justice, right? And so the oral histories were a way to capture the narrator stories. And all of the oral histories were done with the tape recorder across the table, pre-pandemic. Right, so we would meet. We would have a volunteer that would interview. Very conversational, similar to what we're doing now. Nothing scripted. We had some guided questions, but it was really a conversation. With the interviewer spending more time listening than talking, and the narrator guiding the conversation. Then COVID hit and we had to shift everything to a virtual platform. And even still, it was still an oral history because we wanted people to hear, right? And not pay attention to any kind of visuals, but like actually hear what the narrators were sharing. So we collected the interviews via Zoom, but we got rid of the video recording, right? So all oral histories. So we have 105 oral history narrators we've collected since 2018. And then we've shifted. So we're collecting the oral histories. So now what do we do with this? Because it's not just important just to collect the stories, right? That's not enough, right? Because it was important to educate. So what that involved was one, transcribing, bringing in groups of people from all walks of life to volunteer to listen and transcribe. So that was a form of educating. We also, I brought in college students, film students that served as interns that created video projects. So we have oral history, we have videos, and then we have podcasts. So we created a mini podcast series, COVID at Rikers, and what that experience has been like. And then the next phase is we're working to create a mobile exhibit that will go from borough to borough. So we've kind of had, and I like the question, I think Rachel asked me about change and like how your project has evolved and changed. And it's continually evolved as we are hearing from people in the community, as we are trying to meet the needs of our activists who are on the ground, who say, we need this kind of content. We need this kind of history. We can't find the history out there. Do you have anything? And so we've been able to meet the needs of the community in that way.
It's amazing. That's amazing. Continuing on this theme of form and making those choices, I'm curious, Nick, I first was introduced to your work as a performer, but you're a multifaceted artist who works in a variety of different mediums. And I wonder if you could talk to us about your project Cryuone, which, exists sort of, I guess, maybe 10 years ago, the word multi-platform was a thing. Thank God that's maybe not really a thing anymore. But, it exists in sort of different facets to express this core idea. So I wonder if you could share a little bit about what the project is and the different formats it take and how you arrived at those decisions.
Yeah, thank you. Really honored to be here. It's good to see everyone. Yeah, Cryuone, sort of an amalgamation of a lot of work, like I think all this work is. I think it was John O'Neill who helped me, the really great storyteller and founder of the Free Southern Theater and Junebug Productions, who very early on was like, your work is going to be about two things. If you're in the theater, you're going to be a listener and a seer, and you're going to work on those two things the rest of your life, and you're not going to get real good at them. It's like a lifelong project. Like you're always going to be searching. And so, after Hurricane Katrina, we began to listen to stories because we were really upset about the way our people were being represented in New Orleans. And that process of a really traditional, almost oral history project led into a piece called Eyewitness Central City, where we began to map and animate walking tours and audio tours throughout Central City in New Orleans and sending people on adventures using their phones before there was really like a lot of smartphone technology, and organizing events, live events, and commissioning artists to make work. And it all just led to this sort of need that we wanted to listen to the record. We really felt it was important, but similar to Regina, the questions were, how do we animate the record? What is the record doing? What kind of policy are we trying to intersect with? What kind of change are we trying to make? And so when Cry One came along, Cry One is a co-production between Art Spot Productions and Mondo Bizarro. And it was a 2.5-mile outdoor processional performance on land that is adjacent to water, not only in Southeast Louisiana, but in 14 locations around the country. But it was also an online storytelling platform. And by that, we were sitting with people and really listening to the records of those who are facing some of the worst displacement on planet Earth with regards to climate change. So we were trying to, as beautifully as we were trying to capture those stories, we were trying to render those stories with the permission of the storyteller into something that would be animated. So we kept the record in an online format. We showed the films as community engagement tools in the places that we went, but we were also taking the advice of this really beautiful scientist named Mark Davis, who said, look, give us enough facts so that we stay with you, but enough fantasy so we go on a ride. You know, like you've got to animate this in a way that helps the public imagination dream about what it is we want to do about all this stuff. And so that was the sort of impetus. Cry One, thanks to a woman named Joisha Dutta from Another Gulf is Possible, started to work in the policy realm as a policy salon. And it continued to be a concert and a live performance. And it ended when it was all finished after 8 years as a documentary film, which you can witness now as well. So try to find a way to keep it alive beyond those who can just show up at a live performance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's beautiful. You know, that makes me think about this question that I think it would be a reoccurring question, and it was a constant theme in you know, responses from the audience, which is this idea about sort of issue fatigue or topic fatigue, and you know, dealing with like that particular the issues that you're dealing with in that piece, you know, and you're in a region where this is like people's life, and this has been people's life for generations, perhaps. Like, how do you feel like your work sort of like cuts through that malaise and sort of like helps people do whatever it is that your invitation is presenting to them?
That's a great one. You know, first, I just want to say, like, I'd like to just lift up all the ways we fail, because that is in some ways where we're consistently being taught. I'm recognizing that in my own body right now with Hurricane Ida, and the ways in which when it came back through again, I was kind of like, I thought I was over this Katrina stuff. And then a lot of, like, you know, there was no water in New Orleans, but there was a lot of internal injury, and there's a lot moving in the interior landscape. And so I just want to say that first, it's like a lot of failure and some successes. And the way I think, Michael, that I keep coming back to it though, is to watch the people, like just to watch and listen to what the people do in crisis. That's the most inspiring thing ever. Like the amount of mutual aid that was going on just in the city of New Orleans after Hurricane Ida, to me, it was at a whole nother level. It was mind blowing to me. And so while it was tiring and exhausting and there was issue fatigue, the flip side of it was like the people and the culture and the way the response happens and the way that people are now organizing via social media and Venmo and all. It's just like there was millions of dollars literally moving through small, tiny efforts, you know, and that became heartening to me. It also reminded me that the culture is always, it's like water, you know, it finds the ground and it's always ahead of us. And so I think the climate thing here, Ida made me realize like, it's 5 years ahead of where I thought it was, maybe 10, but also the people are there. So where I was a little bit more, it's weird about this thing about crisis before, I was kind of lost before Ida. And then it reminded me again of all the things that like, we need to slow down, hold each other dear, and like really just be who we are, which is inherently like in South Louisiana, some fun ass people. You know what I mean? It's just like some people who know how to eat, gather with each other, play music, and then take care of each other when we're hurting. So that's how, I don't know if the work always does it, but I know the people are doing it. And I think the work just tries to tail on and ride on the people's coattails for inspiration.
Yeah, that's a beautiful thought. That's a beautiful thought. You know, I'm curious too, like, does, you know, given the sort of deep connection to that cultural tradition, you know, does when a new crisis like Ida emerge, does it provide an opportunity for very old solutions, very old traditions to emerge in your brain?
I think that the about what the memory, I was thinking about this when Regina said it. I always think that the memory, the listening is the great innovator, because we all know that there are so many forces that purposefully subject us to they stonewall memory. They don't want us to remember, right? And so the memory, I feel like the act of listening and remembering is the innovator. It's the catalyst for what change might come. And yes, I totally think nothing new under the sun down here. I mean, there's been storms like that for 200 years, and you're right. What they do is they recenter, that you wake up and you go, what can I do in service today? So then after those 2 months, when you go back to like ordinary life, then life becomes quite vacuous in a way, because the real meaning of what we should be doing, to me, is like that act of being together. So I totally think while it surfaces those dark memories, it surfaces an old way of being too. It helps us to remember an old way that, to me, is really powerful.
Yeah, that's profound. I think, you know, this listening, man, listening, that's like one of those ideas that I think I personally have come back to again and again. And when folks are ask me, oh, you know, what does it take to be a good storyteller? How do you be a good this or that? I'm always like, listening. Like, listening is far harder than you ever imagined it to be, you know. And in some ways, I joke, I feel like you could separate all of humanity into two categories. There's the people who will like listen to you and then maybe ask you questions, and then there's the people who you're talking who will never ask you a single question, and then you kind of know that they're not really listening. You know, it's a broad generalization about humanity, but you know, I think it's back to this idea of listening, which is also, ironically enough, coincidentally enough, not ironically, how Steven and I met together with Rachel, working way back when for StoryCorps. And we were in the early days of StoryCorps and the Griot tour, traveling the back roads of America, like Zora Neale Hurston and Alan Lomax. And, you know, Nick, you had mentioned Baba John O'Neill, who, the cultural minister, or created the cultural wing of SNCC, who's like, one of the OGs who was really thinking about this. And one of the questions I had asked him once was about how he chooses the work that he said. And in so many words, he was kind of like, sometimes you choose the story, but sometimes the story chooses you. And, Steven, I've had the great pleasure to read your work over the years. You're an incredibly prolific writer and thinker. And, I'm really curious how you started this work around HIV. I know your work around BuzzFeed and the Michael Johnson story. Of all your work that you've read, that BuzzFeed article on Michael Johnson, that work, I think, is some of my favorite work that I read of yours. And I'm curious how you sort of started on this path, and, did you find the story or did the story find you?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, as a multi-hyphenated hustler, you taught me a lot of what I know. And thinking back to meeting in StoryCorps, one of the most valuable things about that was that people would talk to each other, but if someone came in alone, one of us would interview them, and we all worked in pairs. So, and then one of us would have to record when a single person came in. So in that year, we got to see the 18 others of us interviewing. And that's a really unusual experience. I'm finding and reflecting on now that I'm a professor in a journalism school, to get to watch other people interview and to learn how to listen. So I learned a lot of it from working with you. That particular story was brought to me by my editor, Mark Schufs, who himself had written about HIV for 2 decades or more, and brought it to me and pointed out something that's sadly common in journalism, that this young man had been arrested for HIV transmission, and all the news about it was a police police press release. And that's so common with local news and internet news that the police hand out something and it just gets reported as news. No one listens to the people involved. And so Mark said to me, why don't you go to St. Louis and talk to him in jail and talk to the people who are accusing him and the people in the community and listen to what they have to say. My initial interest in HIV in the first place had also come from a background interview I did in the South Bronx with a new director of the LGBT center there. And it was just sort of a background interview to see what they were doing. But he had said one thing to me that popped into my memory. And from working at StoryCorps as an audio person, you often listen for the one line somebody's saying that makes you say, okay, here's where the story is going to go. And the director of the center had been talking about how they would put on drag balls that we now have all seen in Pose and RuPaul's Drag Race, and they would put on these balls and young people could come to them. They're $5, but if they got tested for HIV, they could come in for free. So it was this way to encourage people to get tested. But then they also became really horrified when they found out that some of the young people who were also homeless, who found out that they're HIV positive through these tests, some of them were actually selling their HIV meds on the street because that's what they needed to do to get cash to stay alive. And so that really first pulled me into seeing that HIV was an ongoing crisis in the United States, and that it would be something that I really wanted to spend time writing about and thinking about. And there are still about 1 million people living with HIV in the United States. And so I tried to make my reporting on that about listening to the people who are living with it and the way that it reveals many systems of disparity, which of course the COVID pandemic has done on a much broader scale. And I was thinking during the land acknowledgement earlier about something I want to share, and that is at the heart of what I'm trying to do now, was that in the last couple of weeks, we've become aware that the number of COVID deaths has surpassed the number of AIDS deaths in the United States. And it happened in less than 2 years. And in one way, particularly around what we're talking about today, I don't like to reduce things to numbers. The number of lives is not as important as listening to people individually. But at the same time, I think about all the culture and all the stories of 40 years and grief of AIDS death being compressed into 20 months. And it's kind of overwhelming to think about how many people are coping with the loss of someone they loved in such an overwhelming environment of death that's so normalized that a lot of people are not having the chance to grieve. Certainly in the beginning of the pandemic, it was so common across a broad swath of deaths, not just from COVID, that people couldn't gather for funerals, memorials. They could not be in community for storytelling. And so I've been thinking a lot lately about how to tell the stories of the dead in this time when there are so many to tell.
Yeah. I mean, that's a profound way to think about that. I think it was your column in the Scientific America that was the first time I'd heard HIV/AIDS crisis referred to as a pandemic and not just as an epidemic. But I think that's a really profound way to think about it on this global scale. In your sort of course of the 10+-ish years that you've been, reporting on this topic and reflecting on it and thinking very deeply now for your forthcoming book, can you reflect on what the difference between the stories you might tell at the quote unquote height of the crisis, and by height, I mean like cultural awareness, which certainly I read in your article as well, one of your articles in Scientific America, that is 2004 was the height of HIV deaths, which is not, in my head, how I associate the height of the crisis. Like somebody who, I was kind of raised and politicized and shaped by the crack epidemic and the HIV epidemic. So it never really thought about 2004 as being the peak of that. So, I'm curious, what's the difference between sort of the way stories are, what stories are told then at the height of it versus now as we look at, where the crisis is in this moment?
Sure. So I guess one thing that's important to differentiate, 2004-05 was the peak of global AIDS deaths, but they did peak in the United States in 1996. And that was because we got access to antiretroviral medications that took 7, 8, 9, 10 years to even reach other places in the world. So their death rates continued to soar for another 7, 8 years. And there's something similar we're seeing now as many countries have not gotten access to COVID vaccines. And then there's a big difference in what I call the pre-ARV period, before the antiretrovirals and after, that AIDS was perceived to be a death sentence for the first 15 years or so we were aware of it, because there was no guarantee that anyone would live. Some people did. They were either infected late enough or just were lucky that they didn't die. But for many people, it was a definite death sentence. And so everything around it was narrated that way. And the theory that comes out of it that I think is practical and helpful for thinking about a lot of our modern politics, there's a theory called futurity that made us think about the ways in the United States we often narrate what's going to happen in the future around children, not just any children, white middle-class children. The cover, if anyone saw the cover of the recent Newsweek that was wringing its hands about whether or not children should get vaccinated. And we often imagine things in the future. And so the death of gay men who also were not reproductive in the traditional sense, and even adopting in gay communities was not particularly common then, had to find meaning in their lives and ask, are our lives of value in this moment, not knowing how long we're going to live? And of course, there are broad spiritual and existential ways that can apply to anyone, because nobody knows how much time they have. But certainly within one community, it was a defining characteristics of the way that people thought about being in community, being in relationship to one another. The dynamics of that pandemic were such that people could be physically together in a way that this one is not allowed for, our present one. So that's a big difference. And then I think as a journalist, historians are starting to take up AIDS because some time has passed. It always takes historians a couple decades to start writing about things. And so there is kind of a big interest now. And I think the COVID pandemic accelerated the interest in early AIDS from historians, but from journalists and from other cultural makers, the defining thing, I would say, within the United States, somewhat globally too, but particularly in the United States, was that after 96, people had to convince Americans that this was still a crisis. And at one point, just a few years ago, the last time the CDC projected, I think in 2016, 1 in 2 Black men who have sex with men is still projected to become HIV positive. That rate alone, we're a country that would make Black men who have sex with men have the highest rate of HIV in the world. And that, of course, reveals lots of structural things that also reveal why COVID is so bad in Black America as well. So the biggest thing I would say for stories after 96 was convincing publications and the public that this is an ongoing crisis, that many people do not have access. The medication saved lives, but many people simply don't have access to them. And that became, I'd say, the biggest change after the drugs started to be used. And thinking globally, also just trying to help people understand these drugs are available, many countries simply can't get them. And that narrative was largely driven by the Gates Foundation and the Clinton Foundation and sort of neoliberal public health organizations. And of one country, Brazil, did just break the patent and make their own drugs and saved a lot of lives out of it. And that's a story I think that lots of countries should be considering right now as the patents are still being held on COVID medications.
Yeah. We'll see. Drugs, man, that's a pharmaceutical, that's a whole other, crisis in and of itself, right? But pharmaceuticals makes me think about this sort of like a question that sort of came up from a lot of the survey respondents in this session around care and the ethics of care. And I sense this, the audience is a lot of folks who are doing this work and really engaged in the sort of mechanics. I'm wondering, and this is a question for all of you, and we can start with you, Regina, is around, what Dr. Steven was just saying around this idea of like this compressed nature of the last 2 years of this particular COVID-19 pandemic that we find ourselves in, where there's been so much death, so much loss. In some ways that is compounds or as a visual representation for the way that I feel like many of our colleagues who do this work around storytelling in crisis feel while doing this work. We're often with people who are sharing the most intimate, difficult, traumatic experiences of their lives, and we have to like take that in some ways. And so, the first part of that question is how you how you do that, how you handle that, how do you give yourself space to process that, Regina, on your team, particularly this year when, you mentioned this earlier in your response around how you had to pivot to be able to tell these stories. And so how do you deal with that as a team, that sort of self-care? And then how does it translate out to like the decisions you make around the space that you're creating for those people to share their stories?
I just saw a comment in the chat. There's no space, right? But we have to make that space. So we're very intentional. Even as part of the oral story collection process, when we were meeting with the narrators, in the beginning, we were asking people to come to us so that we can hear their stories, or they can share their stories. And then we shifted to, we went to where people were at, went to communities, and partnered with organizations that were on the ground doing the work, so that there was a friendly face when they walked in the door, right? And there was someone there that they knew, as well as myself, that would be present for that aftercare piece. We actually have like a little one-pager that we give out for aftercare practices, right? Thanking them, appreciating the time they spent, and then some strategies for, how do you process what it was that you just shared, right? One of the things that we heard a lot was that nobody's asked me these questions. Nobody has had me think about these things, right? I've never had an opportunity to talk about these things. So, so allowing space right after the interview to process, and we trained our interviewers for that as well. So how do you hold space? How do you hold space for the person that's in the room, and then yourself as well, right? As you're hearing. So it was, like I said, it was very intentional, making the time. If we were allowing for an hour interview, it was going to be an hour 15, an hour 30 minutes, right? So that we could have that aftercare being really a part of the process. And then even within our team, and our volunteers, we started doing transcribing parties, right? So as opposed to sending out transcripts and everybody individually is in their own space, hearing and possibly internalizing some really trauma, right? And not being able to have anybody to talk about it, we would have transcribing parties where once a week on a Wednesday night, we would all come together and just be in the same space, listening, and then pausing and reflecting and learning, right? It was a real learning opportunity for people to learn from the narrators about what was happening, and then share a space with each other to kind of reflect on what they were hearing. And so it just became a process for everything that we did, from collecting the stories to transcribing the stories, and then even activating stories. So at the beginning of every team meeting that I have, I take space. Where are you at right now? How are you feeling about what you've heard? It's funny, one of my interview questions when I'm hiring is even, do you have an outlet, or do you have a support system around you that if this becomes difficult, because it will become difficult, that you can talk to, right? Because aftercare is so important and has to be a part of the process. I had to check myself at one point, because it got to a point I was hearing repeated stories, it's the same thing. And I can't say that I was getting desensitized, because it would affect me every time. But then when I would communicate with people who this was the first time they were ever hearing this, I wasn't conscious that this was the first time they may be hearing this trauma, right? And so throughout the process, I've even had to check myself and where I'm at in all of this. And my brother-in-law unfortunately passed away in prison right after, during the pandemic. So, even just having to take the moment, I had to take a little time off, right? It's because it was like, now this is even closer to home, right? Like it's within my family. So I just want to say that it's so important, the care. And I just wanted to touch really quickly just about, I was thinking about how all of our projects kind of intersect and things that we are doing and what's in common. And it made me just really think about how, whether it's COVID, in incarceration, where they were talking about environmental and climate change issues, where we're talking about AIDS, we're all looking for digging into a deeper message about the fundamental human rights of all people, right? So of all people. And, in the context of the Rikers Public Memory Project, we're like, it doesn't matter what a person was accused of, right? There's a fundamental human right, right? So we are trying to shift this criminalizing narrative around people that are detained in prison, as well as, the whole abolition movement. But I really was like reflecting on the work that each of us is doing and how it's about fundamental human rights of people and making sure that people recognize those. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's amazing how crisis reporting, crisis storytelling really does provide a portal, a prism to be able to look at these deeper issues. I thank you very much, Regina, for sharing the personal bits of your personal experience. Thank you. I hope you have the support that you need to navigate these things. I think one of the more extraordinary things about your project, to me, is that sort of group transcription process. That's kind of it's an absolutely amazing. Yeah, it's really an amazing model and an really interesting innovation that I hadn't heard of before. Combining that and the aftercare sheet, is there one item on that you can highlight that like you really enjoy yourself personally? And maybe it's something you've already said, but I'm curious if there's like one step of that aftercare that like really kind of like is your kind of return to.
Well, I think, my favorite is actually the transcribing parties. And originally it was in person. So we had, our office space was a WeWorks space in Harlem. And we asked all the volunteers to come and bring their laptops and sit around a conference table. And we were able to do one of those right before the pandemic hit. And so then just being able to shift it to a virtual space and giving people the opportunity to, so one of the things that was amazing for me is how people wanted to share what they were hearing, right? And so when we thought about this project and having volunteers involved, we never really consciously realized how through the volunteers, the message could be shared even more, right? So we would have volunteers like the next session would invite 3-4 other people to come to hear and to be a part of it and to learn. And so I think that was something that really surprised me. It wasn't something that I anticipated. And it wasn't a voyeuristic type of environment either. It was really concerned, how can we do things differently? How can we make an impact? And so it also allowed us to expand some of the campaign work we were doing and get our message amplified.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. That also, sort of begs the question, I think, is on the minds of a lot of these folks. And, Steven, I just want to go back to you where, you're very often dealing with people who are in very difficult situations. Like, how do you create the conditions for an individual to feel comfortable to share?
It's trying to listen carefully, and I'm so touched listening to your story, Regina. I admire your work, and my condolences on your brother-in-law. I try to do stuff in community when I can. This is getting increasing. It's been very difficult in the past couple of years, and it's my privilege to teach new journalists, college students, and I have been thinking about how do you make people comfortable, and one of the ways is you want them to feel like you actually care about them. And the best way to do that is actually caring about them. And journalism by its nature can be very transactional. I try to practice community journalism or relational journalism. And I try to stress that everything is a relationship. there's a person in my book who coined the term viral underclass, Sean Strube. And I write about this in my book. He does a lot of work with people who've been accused of HIV transmission. Some are spending their lives in prison. And I talked to him about the case I worked on with him. The person we got him out after 7 years, but many of the people are likely not going to get out, or they're going to get out when they're very old. And Sean said something that really stayed with me about how even if all you can do is listen to someone, you owe them that. Because sometimes just the act of listening to them is all they need. We're inclined to think we must save them, we must change their circumstances, grant publicity. Of course, those things have their place, but sometimes just listening to people is all that they need in that moment. And so I try to, this is something I picked up from StoryCorps, which is not economically helpful in terms of money or time. But if I even need a sentence from someone for a story, I talk to them for at least an hour. One, because I am genuinely interested, and I'm grateful to have a chance, and particularly now that I've gotten to do some interviews outside again, but I'm grateful for a chance just to talk to someone and hopefully to build a relationship with them. It might be a relationship that's short, it might be a relationship that leads to other relationships. But I try to be mindful, especially because, particular to writing about HIV, so many people are interested in them for their virus. That's the funders want it, public health people want it. That's like the way they come into the public view. And I've been, as someone who doesn't live with HIV, I've tried to be very conscious of not making people feel like that's all I'm talking to them about. But even how I got into HIV in the first place is because I just went to talk to someone in a job and wanted to see what's going on, with you, what's happening here. And out of that, I found the story that I've been with for almost a decade now in different ways. So yeah, I try to make sure I'm listening to whole people, not looking at my watch, not trying to not have the next question planned, and actually listen to what they're saying. And I am upfront with them. I'll tell them, I'm talking to you for a story for this reason, and very little, a sentence or two might be in it, but I'm genuinely interested in hearing about your life and what you're doing. And of course, there might be a completely different story about that. But they appreciate being listened to and not having me be like, tell me what you can tell me right now. So that's kind of my approach.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, I think, building on that, Nick, I think, I'm reminded of conversations that you probably don't remember, but we've had years and years ago about even the language that we use when talking about this. For example, collecting stories is a big one, and like, I'm curious, like, how you sort of navigate that. And, particularly recognizing that you have a very particular collaborative ensemble practice. So your work is not only in community, but it's a community of community, making work in community, if that makes sense, and not saying the word community too many times. But, I think that ensemble practice is particularly sort of like resonant in these discussions, because we're often working with groups and sort of managing, different individuals who are all bringing what they're bringing to the work, and so talk to me a little bit about how you think about how sort of even the language you use internally for your team might affect the decisions that you make and the way that you sort of navigate and give space for grief within your team.
That's good. Regina, thank you for being vulnerable and sharing, and yeah, big love to you and your family. Michael, I'm thinking about the story circle and how what Steven just said, he just goes and he listens to people. I can't think of how many story circles, hundreds that I've been a part of, where people walk away after a 30-minute story circle and they look as though they have experienced an act of magic. And it's basically, you sit in a circle, you don't speak, a crosstalk, and you listen to someone for 3 minutes at a time. And it's the simplest technology with like the most profound results every time. And I think because there's such there's a deficit of attention in our lives, and because we are so often receiving so much information, that even 3 minutes is like such a profound thing. So I'm thinking about that thing about collectivity. One of our practices is that we check in and we check out as like a safe space for ourselves. So we never have a meeting where everybody doesn't have a chance to check in or check out. You check in at the beginning, you check out when you leave as our collective, because we acknowledge that you're human and you come with the stories that you have for the day, and that you're not just there to do the work or to go do the listening for the project or whatever. You also need to have all of the avenues to express what it is that you have on your heart as well. And it was just been, I think Amy just said it in the chat. I would read that, and that's what I was thinking was like, once I had the experience of someone listening to me in a way that revealed something about my own story that I didn't even know, that's when I realized, oh, that's the care we all need to take for one another. And I think what happens to our work sometimes, Michael, around the collective is we move too fast. We move faster than that speed of care. Like we move too fast for that care, and everything breaks down. And although the work can be good, it really truly can't be great, because we're not caring for that whole. And in terms of thinking of how to like story collection, story gathering, now I just think of it as we're just part of the big ensemble. Like we're all the narrators and we're all part of it. And this thing of us leading anything, I've squashed that down. Like I just don't believe it anymore. I don't believe any person's expertise. I think it can guide certain things, but I learn more from being thinking of ourselves as just our community. Like we always like the community. It's like we're the community too, you know. We're learning, we're messing up. So just thinking of ourselves as all part of the community with various degrees of expertise. Like I really like good bread. I appreciate the bakers, you know what I mean? And I like to think about it that way. But at the end of the day, we're kind of trying to enjoy one another's expertise as a whole, instead of thinking of ourselves as a siloed, individuals or organizations or collectives. And I would say too, Michael, one thing, we have no resources in the city of New Orleans. Like there's literally no funding. And so you can't do anything if you don't collaborate with everyone. And so that is helpful in a way too, to the collective.
Go ahead.
Can I share something in response?
Yeah, please.
Thank you for that, Nick. That's fantastic. I recently had an experience last week where I was grading papers, and I came across the most common thing that I've probably seen in my time as a professor is that students kept referring to nonfiction books as a novel. And I kept writing, not a novel, not a novel, not a novel, not a novel. And then I thought, what if the novel actually means something different than I think that it means? And like I talked to them and I found out, oh, they think a novel means a story that has plot and characters and that moves them in some way. And I started thinking about how, okay, like that could apply to nonfiction books or fiction books. And then I realized in other countries, the fiction nonfiction boundary doesn't exist. I found out that since the 1960s, Truman Capote's been calling for the nonfiction novel. But for me, it was a really interesting moment to check myself that as a professor, I'm often keyed to say like, I am right and you are wrong. And it was a good moment for me to think, if I'm listening, I'll find out like words don't always mean what I think that they mean. And a lot can come from that. And how important it is to listen, particularly like when you're in a position of power in a relationship, how important it is to listen and take as possibly valid what people are saying to you. And I also thought of when Nick was talking about listening uninterrupted to 3 minutes, something one of our StoryCorps colleagues, Vero, would say in groups is she would ask them to say like, how many of you have had a conversation of an hour with another person, and have them raise their hands. And then a conversation an hour where you weren't eating food, or the TV wasn't on, and you weren't listening to music. And it's quite unusual that we have uninterrupted times of actually listening to one another. And Nick, the story circle really reminded me of the power of when you're conscious of listening to people without other interruptions.
Yeah, that's amazing. Just to be able to have that sort of unhindered, unencumbered, uninterrupted space to just listen. Like, we can't underestimate how profound that is of an opportunity, both for ourselves and the people who we, bless us with the opportunity to be able to share space together and share their experiences. There's also something else I wanted to lift up that Nick said around sort of resources. Like, it's always the, kind of elephant in the room, so to speak. And we wanted to sort of kind of focus this conversation around, some of these nitty gritty things that often I feel like we don't talk about around trauma and ethics and sort of decision making. But, a number of people sort of wrote in on the survey being like, I'm in a small town. How do I do this? How do I do this? What do I do? So, I really appreciate you mentioning that, Nick. And, I don't know if there's anything else that you would want to add to this sort of like, response that we got from some people on this survey who are in this, may have come to this audience who are like, I'm in this small town. I can't do anything because I don't have any money. Like, how does that make you think in terms of like the decisions that you've made, Nick?
It's one thing that so we've tried to hold up as a group is that we can't at once acknowledge the abject conditions of our economics in society, right? We acknowledge it all the time, but then when it comes to doing our work, we're constantly fighting like all of the things that come with, I don't get enough attention, we don't get enough resources, we don't get enough funding, which is all of the trappings of that very dark and ugly capitalistic society, So one has been just trying to keep putting ourselves in front of one another and other people that are like to remind ourselves the work is powerful. Just the act of listening to one thing is powerful. Whether there's ever a website for it or an archive for it, it's held us up as people for probably thousands and thousands of years. So that's been like a constant struggle, just like making sure that we're giving ourselves some love, whether or not you're going to get it from anybody else. Never letting someone dictate the narrative about what our work is. Like, we have to believe that it's powerful first. And then two, I would say like the biggest thing I'm moved by, like, Storyline gets together with, USDAC gets together with Arts and Democracy. And it's like, look at this, we've got 250 people on a call. That's power, right? We have power with each other. So I have found that there's no one in America who's doing this work that you probably can't call. Mm-hmm. Most likely can't, email and just holler at them and say like, Regina, what's up? If you ever had some time, could I rap with you? Could I bend your ear and see if there's a way that we can like not no isolation, we're already in enough isolation. Can we lean on the collective, the web, the networks, the alternate routes, the art and democracies, all of these broader networks to share the knowledge, which is really just communal knowledge, it's not proprietary.
Yeah, that's real. I really appreciate you. Thank you, Nick, for lifting that up. This mentality. I mean, and that's like one thing, kind of reflecting on the sort of choices that I've made that like I wish I understood earlier, is that, how we live in a system that is governed by this notion of scarcity, and it's a revolutionary idea to shift to understanding the fundamental value of abundance. And we are all come from abundant communities and places, regardless of how external forces might try to measure and categorize and catalog what we do have. But we know that we are abundant. That's what makes all of this possible, for sure. Yeah, I appreciate that. I think like, reflecting on this sort of some of these work, Regina, I'm wondering what, things that you might have done differently looking back when you started this project. Now, you've gone through, not only dealing with the crisis that, initiated the project, you're hit with a pandemic and you're forced to make sort of certain decisions, you move remotely, and, now you're the situation at Rikers is even more of a crisis, arguably, than it was, 18 months ago. So, what is there anything that you might tell yourself sort of like, 2 years ago around how you organized and approached this project?
Well, one of the things I really appreciate what Nick had said about, the scarcity of resources and being able to have the power to do the work. So one of the things that happened initially, when we were talking about we were going to collect these these oral stories, the idea was that we were going to archive them and gift them to the New York Public Library, because Rikers is a part of New York City's history. So it needs to be a part of New York City's history. So all of our release forms, everything that we were creating was all, you know, had the kind of the red tape of New York Public Library and bureaucracy and all of that. And it didn't stop us. It didn't interfere with anything that we did, but it was just like something that was there. And then the pandemic hit, and then the libraries all shut down, right? So there was no movement for almost, you know, over a year. So we had to ask ourselves, are we going to just wait until the library is ready for us? We don't know when that's going to be. Are we going to, you know, are we going to sit with our hands tied because we, you know, this resource that we were expecting is no longer available? You know, what are we going to do? How are we going to shift? And so because of that closed door, that momentarily closed door, it created all of this other innovation, right? So we had to rethink how we were going to share our stories. And so that's how really the, you know, working with the college students, reaching out to all of the local colleges and having film students come in and be a part of the project and creating, like listening and reflecting and, you know, demonstrating what it was they were hearing. We had an animator, we had a number of other film students that were either photographers or cinematographers working on documentaries. If it wasn't for that momentary closed door with the New York Public Library, I don't know if we would have had that creation of student stories, a new digital collection. Same with the COVID podcast, right? So we were able to take what seemed like a closed door and then just run and create so much within the community, right? Using the community and not focusing on something that what seemed at the moment like was an obstacle, right? So I really, that was something that I look back at, and I think like early on, we should have maybe looked more at eternal resources, right? Now we are working with the New York Public Library. Things are open back up. And so the amazing thing was while that was a closed momentarily, we were still able to work in two veins, right? So we kind of split. So we still are going to have the New York, gift our collection to the New York City Public Library, and that will be a part of the New York history, but we also have a whole nother avenue of creative work that will now inform our mobile exhibit that will be going from borough to borough. So it's just really amazing to see how we had it within and just needed like a little push to make it happen. So
sometimes all you need is a little push, right?
Yeah.
And that's beautiful. Like, I think libraries are like one of those sort of like thought of spaces that are for many communities, especially in this era of like neoliberal policy where we're losing social services. Libraries are a hub for so many communities, and they're an amazing resource in so many ways. So I'm glad you sort of for the work that you're doing, but particularly for just mentioning libraries, because when thinking about being in communities that like, you know, maybe you feel like you're struggling for resources, that's like part of that sort of abundant ship that we can turn to, because there are libraries in many communities, and they are sort of one of the sort of last remaining sort of public common resource spaces that are amazing, right? I really, this conversation, I could talk for sort of hours and hours with you. I have like about a dozen more questions for each of you. Lucky for our audience, we're in about 5 minutes. We have an opportunity to break out. And in those breakout groups, we'll have an opportunity for folks to kind of, you know, share projects that you're working on. Each breakout group will have a facilitator. But, you know, but it'll be an opportunity to ask these questions and sort of dig in deeper about work that you're doing. In this last couple minutes, I want to ask each of you, starting with Steven, is there anything else that you'd like to share about your work? I could ask you many questions, but I just want to leave it open about the sort of like line of inquiry that we've been going on so far. You're muted, brother.
Acting just like I do in my day job. Thanks. When you were talking about being a multi-hyphenated hustler, I thought about a term I've used. I write about discursive hustling and queer of color interviewing, and I think about the ways that I try to shuttle what happens in kind of my queer life into the academy and back out. And I've been thinking a lot as you've been talking, and it's so exciting hearing what Regina and Nick both had to say about queer ephemera and how many stories are in things that are sort of ephemeral, and how so much of our internet discourse could be quite ephemeral from this period of time. So thinking how to archive it for the future. And I've also been kind of, actually, no, I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. Nick?
Yeah, I'm just thinking so much right now about all the teachers, just all the people who've been doing this work for so long. And I wrote in the chat, Spider Speculations by Joe Carson. I'm thinking about like what it means to keep water in the roots and to want to stand in certain lineages, just to keep honoring the people who've done it, there's a lot of amnesia around, and there's so much information, it's hard for me to even keep track. So I'm just moved that this is grounding me, this conversation right now, and I'm anxious to learn about how we keep lifting up the big family tree of this story work, going back and back and back, and yeah.
Thanks for bringing Joe Carson into the room. Regina?
So I just wanted to share, I'm going to drop in the link, some of ways that people can be a part of the work that we're doing. We have, the Close Rikers campaign, and we're really calling on the mayor to close, keep the commitment to close and follow through with closing Rikers. So I've dropped in a link for that so that you can, email Eric Adams. And then there's also another link that I'll drop in for those that are part of organizations and their organizations want to join the campaign to close Rikers. And like I mentioned before, like everything that we do is to honor the narrators, to make sure that their memory or the history of Rikers is told by those that were directly impacted and no one else, or that to make sure that they're not excluded, because oftentimes we know that history is told from his story, right? So we want to make sure that we help shape how Rikers is remembered, and most importantly, that it gets closed and the atrocities stop. It's happening right there. So I just want to share that.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you for sharing that. Thank you, Steven, Regina, Nick. I think Emily is going to come on and explain to us the breakouts. I guess as that's happening, these lingering thoughts of the elders and tradition, and something Nick said about sort of reaching out to people. Just a shameless plug. I'm gonna say we haven't announced it publicly yet, but Storyline is gonna launch an apprenticeship next year, where we're really gonna have an open call and inviting folks, a couple people in the first year to like just kind of live with our company and sort of like in a real sort of apprentice way that'll mix a little bit of on-the-job training, but also some sort of like hopefully sharing the lineage that we have brought us to this work, and hopefully meeting all you wonderful people. So that's just a little like tease of things to come on our end. Emily, you want to take us to breakout, or explain to us? She's going to come on and explain to us what's going to happen in the breakout groups and what we're going to do after.
Yes, thank you, Michael. This is Emily on speaking. So we're going to spend the next 30 minutes in breakout rooms, as Michael said, each with a facilitator. And we invite you all to share with one another and reflect about what you've heard so far using your listening skills that we've been talking about, and also share about work relevant to this theme of storytelling and crisis. So if you have any technical difficulties or issues or questions, you can return to the main room, and I'll be here and I will do my best to assist you. So with that, we can start breakout rooms. Jacqueline, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Did you not go to breakout room 9?
I went to a room that Karen Atlas was already facilitating.
Oh, okay. Let me put you in the right room.
Okay.
Hi, Karen. Hi, Sonia. Do you need assistance?
No, I'm good, thanks.
Okay, you just want to hang out in the main room?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, Anita. Hi, Kristen. We're in breakout rooms now. Would you like to be moved into a breakout room?
Yes, I was actually in a breakout room, but it either kicked me out or something happened. I don't know, and it wouldn't reconnect to it. I think I was in breakout room 6.
6. Okay, I can move you there.
Thank you.
Anita, would you like to be moved to a breakout room? Hi, Margot. Would you like to be moved to a breakout room?
Sure, thank you so much.
Okay. Hi, Tharza. Would you like to be moved to a breakout room? Hi, would you like to be moved into a breakout room? Joe?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, would you like to be moved into a breakout room for the next 15 minutes?
I'm actually in a breakout room, but I'm gonna have to leave soon. And I was wondering if you could share the link to the resources.
Yes, that will come. Oh, let me find that actually. And then we're also going to send out an email to folks who registered.
Oh, who registered? Okay, great.
I'll type the document in the chat right now.
Great. Thanks so much.
You're welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Yes, thanks for coordinating. Bye-bye.
Bye. Hi, Carol. Is there anything that I can do to support you?
Hi, sorry I'm late.
Oh, no worries. We're just having breakout rooms and they're about to end in a few minutes. So we're
Yeah.
going to have a closing discussion after that.
Okay, thank you. Am I able to listen into a breakout room or?
Sure, I can put you in one.
Thank you.
Hi, Michelle. Hi, Forward Together Movement Building. We're just wrapping up breakout rooms right now. So do you want to just hang tight or sit
Yeah,
tight?
I'll just hang tight. I had to go pick up my daughter from school. So
There will be a closing discussion in a few minutes.
cool. Emily, do you know if I know it's being recorded. Is there a way to access the recording later if we had to miss part of it?
Yes, if you registered, we will send a recording and a resource document out later.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Hi, Celinda. Are you joining us now?
Yes, I joined as We're Together Movement Building. Sorry. I was here at the beginning and then I had a meeting like in the middle. So I missed the chunk of the middle. So thank you for being willing to share the recording.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks.
Welcome back. Thank you so much for sort of engaging in that conversation. I hope it was rich. My breakout group is a real rich, deeper conversation. Makes me, deeply grateful for the privilege of this space to share with y'all. Yeah, we were got timed out as soon as the people were still talking and sharing as soon as we switched out. So sorry you got cut off, Liza. Thank you for sharing. Emily, I have a bit of a technical question. What we're going to do now is we're going to go around and just have a little kind of report back of the facilitators from each group. And Emily, I'm inviting some of your guidance on how that'll work. If you just sort of unmute the facilitators one by one. I'm not sure who were facilitators, but if we could start with room one.
Sure, I could do that. I believe you were in room one.
Oh, word. I was trying not to go first. Our discussion was super rich. Some folks who were working in the climate movement and as activists had an opportunity to share, as well as a dancer and some other performers, people in the performing arts world. So that was really great. I think one of the things that resonated with me is Evan Bissell sort of shared this notion of the idea of stories as care. We don't necessarily build in care within the speed of our sort of normal sort of rat race lives. And so that's a really sort of profound thing to think about. I think another thing that we a bunch of people shared different approaches to was this notion of reciprocation. I think, all of us, many of us are sort of wrestling with the nature of how to not feel extractive and icky, and we're just sort of taking a photo of somebody or a story and then running away and they never see it. But what does it really mean? What does reciprocation look like and mean in many different ways? And how do you build that into the process? And another thing that was, I think, really kind of extraordinary thought is it's a notion of language and how are we sharing things across many different languages. But in addition to linguistic languages, what other sort of languages of nonverbal communication, particularly from the perspective of a dancer whose, maybe primary sort of vocabulary is movement in physical space and communicating these ideas in that way. So that's really something that stuck with me. And shout out to Arkansas and wrestling with this idea of parachuting journalists, filmmakers coming from all over to tell the pandemic story, and then right in the middle of you doing your project. And I encourage you to try to keep grinding away at your work, because your work is important, it matters, and you're going to be there long after folks have come in and out, and they're not going to really tell a story that necessarily reflects what you and your community can. And I think that should be an inspiration, because certainly what I heard from you was an inspiration. So thank you everyone for sharing. Is it best to say the next group, just number two, or should we I don't know if everyone's squares looks the same? What do you recommend, Emily?
Sure, I'm spotlighting folks based on which rooms they were in and facilitating. I think another idea we had was for anyone as participants too, if they wanted to share back. But room two is Steven and Tom.
And I invite anyone in our group to do a summary if they prefer. I can start it, which is some questions were asked about how do we find and tell stories as an organic process? Who asks and records stories, in particular around race and shared experiences and how those stories get interpreted. We talked of stories as medicine, magic, as an ancient technology. And that sharing stories can change narratives, including homelessness, and how our body also carries stories and how those are translated, and also the importance of self-care. I don't know if anyone else from our group has anything to add.
Great, Tom, thanks. I would encourage anyone from any of the groups, if you wanted to share back, feel free to raise your hand in the Zoom thing, and then I can spotlight you if you'd like. The next group was Nick and Karen.
Yeah, I'll start us off, but I would love to hear from others. We talked about mental health. We talked about the power of theater. We talked about the importance of the people most impacted, really controlling the stories. We considered how you keep the extraordinary things that happen in the middle of crisis, how you keep those going after things go back to so-called normal, that things can happen in the moment of crisis that then get stopped later. And then we really were starting to ponder this comment that Judy made, and Judy, I welcome you to make it yourself, but it was about in a state, or in a place where there's so much division between people, what are the stories about not being able to tell our stories? And that just really got us, everybody was just like settling into that, and our time ran out. So I don't know, Judy, if you want to say any more about that. No? But it really got us going, that question.
Great. Nick, did you have anything to add? No, okay. Our next group was Regina and Marshall.
Yeah, I can say a few things, and then if anyone wants to add to what we talked about. We really just dug in more to the Rikers Public Memory Project, and kind of talked about the importance of like asking open-ended questions and being really intentional about the ways that we ask questions and the ways that they're framed, to really hear someone's story fully and not assume what they think, or even if they're aligned with the activism that we're doing or advocacy. Yeah, thinking about framing things. I think one thing that resonated with me was Regina talking about like, yeah, just opening with super intentional questions and thinking about like asking who needs to hear your story and why, and thinking about the larger narrative of Rikers and how it's kind of incorporated into New York City's history. And then we got to hear from some other folks about their projects and across different mediums, which was really cool. Does anyone want to add anything?
I see that Phyllis in the chat said that they were happy to share. Oh, I think share their info. Sorry, not their group debrief, but our next group was Rachel.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for holding on, everybody. I've expressed in my small breakout, but I just have so much gratitude for everyone that joined and all the wisdom that's here, that's represented. I think, yeah, Beverly said something that really resonated with me, which is today's conversation feels like the making of a movement, or the maturing of a movement, which is just nice to hear, like the support, right? Like that, that is represented here. And also that like we need more brave spaces instead of safe spaces, right? And so I'm just grateful for the vulnerability that people shared today. I think we had really interesting conversation around, how to like, ways to have collaboration and the balance between, telling, how we have stories that are very painful, but then how to have room for stories of joy and stories of imagination. Is there anything else that anyone else wants to share? But I was just, really grateful for the conversation.
Great. Our next group was facilitated by Hatway.
Hi, can you hear me? Great, thank you everyone that was in my group, we had a great conversation. A lot of folks on the West Coast in the room and different levels of practices and We share some resources and frameworks to talk with young people as well. And there was actually a great question that came that we didn't have an answer for, and perhaps someone in this room might have. And it's thinking about the role of technology, the new technology that people are using, like TikToks, and the ways that young folks are taking advantage of storytelling in that particular platform. And so, you know, what ways and informal ways that folks are recording their own stories and ways to connect with that, and it was about asking questions around how do you preserve that and connect with those stories. So here's a question for the group to ponder, perhaps, or anyone want to elaborate there. I think there was something really rich there. And then we talked about the how hard sometimes, because we're saturated with so many stories and so many competing narratives in different ways in all kinds of, you know, formats, and being able to find your voice and be able to share that and feel confident that what you're working on, it's important and so forth. So there's a lot of conversations there, and talking about the role of white supremacy in that, and some work that some folks are working around COVID as well. So just kind of sharing some highlights. If I missed anything, please jump in, anyone from the group, but just to try to be brief. So thank you so much for sharing.
Thanks, Atway. So also we have Carol. Do you want to share back?
Yeah, so we had such a rich conversation. We had a lot of people who were storytellers, filmmakers working on the topic of climate in our breakout group. And so we were really struck by Nick's comment of, you know, how much fact you give, I'm doing a terrible paraphrase, but, you know, how much fact you give someone versus how much of the like heart or the storytelling that you're really trying to get to. And we talked about how, you know, like Hollywood has just put out, you know, these 3 acts, you know, apocalyptic stories, right? And we talked about really needing to change that narrative, and to change that narrative to challenge what we, you know, might think of stories in the Western world, and how that narrative can be more empowering and make people feel that they have agency.
Thank you, Carol. Jordan, would you like to share back?
Absolutely, 30 seconds or less. Watch me do it. I was really excited with our conversation. The jumping off point was building from a comment by Nick in the larger conversation around moving at the speed of care. The thing that I want to avoid myself talking and summing up what everybody said, we had a ton of really exciting work talked about in our conversation. We had documentary filmmakers, we had organizational leaders, we had folks trying to end the prison system in Portland, Maine. It was a really wonderful spread. And so I'm hoping that maybe folks from that group, if you wouldn't mind, just toss a link to your work in the chat so other folks can check it out. I think that would speak for itself. We were thinking really deeply about how to listen to one another, how to be present with one another. And yeah, I would love for you to share that, and we can all learn a little bit more about you. If anyone else from that group wants to share any other reflections, please, now is the time. I think that was about 30 seconds.
Thank you, Jordan. And Jacqueline.
Yeah, I'm gonna match my colleague Jordan's speedy summary, or try to. So things that I'm recalling from like our conversation, you know, being representative of story sharers and storytellers who are holding stories from the transgender community, to TV hosts, to kind of storytelling and movement like of the body. And I think one of the things that are really that was really profound, like in that were kind of 2 things. One, something that Jameson had shared around, you know, how do we in in sharing the power, and this is all my words paraphrasing, the power of listening to each other. Is there also pairing that with like the self-management of being able to hear a story that counters our beliefs or our values or just our way of knowing, and how do we also pair that in listening as well. And then something that also Brittany shared around really thinking about how are we sharing story and using the language of sharing stories in a way that is amplifying multiple levels and movements that are not just auditory. So thinking about visual, and what struck, what kind of was the thread pulling in that was like, how do we also share stories in a way that are promoting the different ways that we intake stories that are not from an ableist frame of reference. And so how do we also think about that in the language of sharing stories and the receiving of stories? So thank you all.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Again, if anyone who's participating would like to share, you can unmute yourself and I can spotlight you, or you can raise your hand and I can spotlight you. Otherwise, I will hand it off to Michael to close us out.
So I'll unmute myself. This is Phyllis, and I'll tell you what, this really has been medicine for me, because I'm in and out of Zoom meetings all the time, but I don't get this type of connection. You know, you know how it is. Okay. I mean, it just like, I'm like, this does not feel healthy. I mean, my body is like, what? You know, and so I almost didn't make it, and I was like, you know what, I'm gonna get up on here with my people. And I mean, you just brought it on. So I'm just immense eternal gratitude, you know, and all my ancestors say thank you.
So glad you made it.
Well, that's kind of like what I wanted to say on both sides of the equation, because one of the questions was, why do we tell stories? And it's great. I mean, I was feeling a little bit guilty at the beginning of this because I don't like really work in policy change. You know, I work more with individuals, just as, you know, people who are going through or have like an interesting experience. And one of the projects that I worked on, we had just given like a very introspective writing exercise. And this one participant, these were people who were formerly incarcerated and people who were given life sentences, who had spent like 30 years in prison, and they were just out like months, you know, re-entering society. And we've given this very introspective question, and this one gentleman shared, and then he turned his camera off. This was on Zoom. And I kept looking, he said, now I've shared too much, and he turned his camera off. And I kept saying, where's John? Where's John? Long story short, by the end of the session, and just like someone had said that we do the check-in, Nick, I think you said the check-in and the check-out. When he checked out, he said, I feel very good. And for me, it's an honor to work with these people. So not only from the point of view of having people be able to tell their stories. For me, I feel very honored to be part of that equation where people are given the opportunity to share in that way. And it being in this circle, so to speak, this story circle right now is giving me that same to be a part of this community. So I wanted to say thank you again.
Okay, I guess I'll go since my mic was unmuted. So I had a question about.
You are muted again.
Yes, sorry. No, my question before we left was, what does a story circle look like? I have never been part of a story circle.
I'll drop some guidelines in here for you so that we can have that on the community resource. But it really is pretty simply a group of people who get in a circle, a proper circle. You get 3 minutes or however much time you put on it to tell a story. While you're doing so, there's no crosstalk, you just listen. And at the end, you have a period of crosstalk and sharing and reflection. I have this guidelines as offered to us by Junebug Productions, and I'm happy to add them onto this resource list. And I'm also happy to say, like Liza, if you ever want to have a conversation about that or want to follow up on how the email is going to go, happy to have another talk about that to see how we can like share that technology as much as we can.
That would be great. I see that being a wonderful tool just as a brainstorming session for even our own artistic purposes. And just understanding, getting a more well-rounded view and understanding of what the topics that are dear to our hearts and that we're interpreting with our art. So thank you.
And Liza, I can share also the guide that we use because we did story circles through Local Voices Network early on in the pandemic to talk to community members about what they were experiencing. So I can share that Local Voices Network guide as well.
Thank you, Regina. Thank you, Nick. We will be sharing out very soon a list of resources with those things that were mentioned, as well as a long list of projects and ideas and input that were shared by all you wonderful people who took the time to reply to the survey. So thank you for that. It's always a deep privilege and honor for me to be in a room with all of my heroes and people who inspire me and like keep me moving and keep challenging me. So thank you for the gift of your presence and company. I'm really grateful. I'd really like to thank Rachel Falcone for doing what she does, as well as our partners and co-hosts in this project, Arts and Democracy, U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, Naturally Occurring Cultural Districts, New York, and the Laundromat Project. All these co-hosts have all been important friends, as well as important sort of professional colleagues around my personal journey. So I'm deeply grateful for ongoing collaborations. And, on that tip of sort of reciprocity and conversation, feel free to reach out to these groups and these folks and, follow the work and continue this conversation because it's rich. It's been swell. And thank you as well for Regina Campbell, really extraordinary work, really dope. We're going to enjoy continuing to follow it. Nick Sly, thank you very much for sharing your work. And Thrasher had a bounce, but thank you very much to Dr. Steven Thrasher. His work is dope. If you don't know it, look for his byline. It's really beautiful, beautiful work. And on that note, thanks everyone for coming. We hope to hear from you soon, and we'll be in touch. See you soon.
Thank you, Michael Primo. That was beautiful listening and facilitating. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Rachel. Bye.